Hey everyone, welcome to another episode. My guest today, Frederic Laloux, the best-selling author of Reinventing Organizations, which has sold over 1 million copies around the world. The book first came out in 2014, right around when my book, The Future of Work, came out. So I've heard of it. You may or may not have heard of it, although a lot of business leaders that I've talked to are familiar with the concept. Teal organizations, became kind of the very famous concept from that book. And we're going to be talking about a lot of that sort of stuff today. So, Frederic, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, this is exciting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to diving deep into some of these concepts. Before we get into the interview, though, let me just give a quick reminder for a lot of the viewers and listeners. If you want to get access to more of these episodes, remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. And you can get the show notes and the transcripts and things like that at Substack by going to greatleadership.substack.com. So, with that being said, Frederic, why don't we start with what is wrong with organizations today? So, you're looking at the business world. Obviously, you wrote a book called Reinventing Organizations. Why do organizations need reinventing?
One way to look at it is simply to look at, the kind of engagement scores that we have, all these surveys, Gallup or others that look for employee engagement and typically come up with pretty dismal numbers. They've been stuck in like the high 20s, percent of people that say that they feel engaged at work, which means that 70% plus, right? You could ask this other question of, if you didn't need to work for money, if you won the lottery, would you go do your work? And most people would go like, hell no. So we just spend this inordinate amount of time in organizations that most of us feel like we only do because there is a paycheck, and that's ultimately pretty sad. On another level, like I remember when I started in the business world, 20 years ago, there was a sense that we knew how to do management. Like at the time, I remember like say GE, Jack Welch had cracked the code, of management, or if you wanted to make it to the top of an organization, the habits, the 7 habits of highly effective people. Like we sort of had a sense of we knew how to do this. And as everything has become more complex, as organizations have become bigger, as the world is moving faster, and no one is saying that they are very happy with the kind of management that they have. Like behind closed doors, all the CEOs that I know will admit that they're frustrated. Like their organization is too slow, too bureaucratic. There's too much politics. There's too much infighting. So many leaders are burned out, and there's this famous saying that if you look at a pyramid, there's a few people at the top that work way too much, and then everybody else who feels underutilized. And
Yeah.
so, this model that we're using in organizations, the kind of management paradigm that we have, that we're teaching in business schools, has worked well for a while. But I feel that the world has simply become too complex and has moved on, and that our current organizational systems can't deal with the complexities of our time. And so the model is simply outdated. We're ready for something new.
Well, you mentioned something earlier where, the idea of working for a paycheck. And so maybe we can unpack that a little bit, because some people might be listening and watching thinking, what is wrong with working for a paycheck? Because, I think of my dad, for example, who recently retired. He was fine to work for a paycheck. He was grateful to work for a paycheck. That's, because he immigrant from the former USSR. He had a very, very difficult time finding a job. He didn't care about engagement and well-being. There was no conversation about how your leader or your manager treats you. There was none of that stuff. He just wanted a job, and he was grateful for that job. Nothing else mattered. And so I guess what is wrong with that mentality and with that approach? And I guess there's a second part to this where who's responsible for that, right? So let's say you're an employee and that's what you care about and what you value, right? Because there was even a time when I was looking for a job earlier on in my career, I just wanted a job for money too. I was like 16, 17 years old, looking for my first job. I didn't care about any of this stuff. I just wanted to buy like cool stuff, go to the movies with my friends, go to the arcade. And me too, many years ago, I also just cared about a paycheck. So what is wrong with that
I want to
mentality, do
ask
you
you
think,
what
today?
I want to ask you what changed for you. Why was that at some point not enough anymore?
So for me, I guess the pivotal moment for me was after I graduated college. I was probably, this was around 15 or 16 years ago. And so earlier on, like when I was, working at Blockbuster and all these retailers, just there for a paycheck, um, I was always a bad student. So I didn't get good grades in high school. I didn't get good grades in community college. I was kind of like a C student. So my parents were not thrilled. And finally, I got to college, and my parents were like, "Look, this is your last chance. If you screw up here, you will never get a job that will pay you well because, as we know, people really looked at your college degree, your GPA." And so I went to University of California, Santa Cruz, and I don't know, something just clicked in my mind where I was like, okay, no more screwing around. And so I double majored in economics and psychology. I graduated with honors. And then after I graduated, I went to go work for this technology company in LA. And they promised me that I would be doing all these really cool things and traveling the country and meeting with entrepreneurs, and I would have this great impact. And so I took the job. I have a 3-hour daily commute, hour and a half to work, hour and a half back from work. And I'm doing data entry, and I'm doing cold calling, and I'm doing PowerPoint presentations. And I'm sitting there thinking, I was promised that I would be doing all this great stuff. And this company blatantly just lied to me. And one day the CEO comes out of his office and he's like, "Hey, I got this really important project for you." And, he hands me a $10 bill and he's like, "I need you to go down to Starbucks and get me a cup of coffee." And that was the
That's really
last straw for me. I'm like, I don't know what is going on in the business world, but this is not what I signed up for. And maybe partially it's just the different type of role that I had. Like, I don't think when I was working for Whole Foods or when I worked at a movie theater as an usher or worked at Blockbuster, I didn't really have expectations in those roles of any of this other type of stuff. But when I graduated from college and I got my first, you could call it professional job, my expectations were a little bit different because I thought I saw myself as like a business professional, this young college graduate. And I guess I became very disengaged because the company did not view me that way. They viewed me as just I don't know, a cog. I could have been anybody just doing that job. And that became very, very frustrating. But also my expectations, I think, changed a little bit because I no longer just wanted the paycheck. I wanted to do like cool stuff, or I wanted to make an
that's
impact, or something like that.
yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Our expectations have changed, right? Generationally from your father to you, right? And I think it's just part of human evolution. It's just like, you know, if you're just at a survival level and you get a meal a day, you're very happy with that meal, right? You're not asking for variety. You're not asking, for dessert. You're not asking for, right? And then this basic need is met, and we're ready for some other need to be met, right? And I'm pretty sure you would wish for your father that he had had the opportunity to, on top of providing security for the family, to have something that would have felt deeply fulfilling. But for him, that was already amazing,
Yeah.
right? To have, to provide for the whole family, right? And so I think it's indeed rising expectations. It's just a part of human evolution, and that plays a big part in my book. As you know, I've been very fascinated by a number of historians, psychologists, philosophers who've looked at human evolution, and looked at, the more complex societies we build, the more complex our own cognition becomes, right? And the more complex structures we're able to build, right? And our rising expectations is part of that, right? We're no longer content. If we have to, we'll go back to what your dad did, and we'll be just happy to have a job and, to have money at the end of the month. But if we can aim for more, obviously there's part of it that longs for more, right? And we
Mhm.
see that in particular with younger folks. People used to complain about the millennial generation, now Generation Z, right? That they're looking for purpose and that, hopping jobs because, simply getting money is often no longer enough for them.
Yeah, it also poses some, I think, pretty interesting challenges, right? So I'm actually curious, kind of on that historical angle too. You mentioned like psychologists and things like that. So just kind of the history of how it evolved is very interesting to me. And I guess some of the challenges that companies are faced with, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is how do you create like an optimal balance of all of that? and kind of who's responsible for it. There's a lot of push in terms of like well-being programs, engagement programs, because there used to be a time when a company was just a company. Like you would show up to work, you would get paid, they would take care of your benefits and things like that. And then we started giving food, and then we started giving massages and dry cleaning, and then we started doing well-being programs in gyms, and we started doing financial planning and access to a therapist, and like
And then,
all
and
this
then
other
we
stuff.
always cut that when recession looms, right?
Yes, and then
Yeah,
we cut that when things aren't going well.
yeah.
So how do
I
you? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways you can think like, oh, this is all wonderful, right? To offer all these perks. Part of me feels that that's pretty pathetic in some way. We have this old way of organizing, right? I mean, this model that is dominant today, but that is breaking down, where we have this pyramid and we have these layers of management, and we have amazing people who are utilized at just a small percentage of their potential, because there's all these layers of hierarchy that prevent them from doing what they want to do. And then we offer them these side benefits to try to keep them happy,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what I'm excited about is those organizations who have fundamentally switched the model, where do you have, for example, self-managing teams and entirely self-managing organizations, where people are just, not because some CEO has decided to delegate a little bit of power, but by the design and the structure of the organization themselves, have the power to act on whatever problems, opportunities they see,
Yeah.
and where people tend to show up much more whole because the fear levels are down. So you don't have to wear all these masks that we tend to have to wear in most organizations. And when that happens, you don't need the massage table. You don't need the gym. You don't need, the ping pong table, right? Like people just look at that and go like, are we trying to bribe me here with something
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
So I'm much more interested in fundamentally rethinking these structures and organizations, than trying to patch up that model with some perks that you give when times are good and it's hard to
And
employ
take away when
people,
times are tough.
and you
Yeah.
go like, oh, we have to retain our best people, so let's give them perks. And then when times get tougher, the first thing you cut is all of these programs,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And
So you tell me where does it make sense to go? Because I have two kind of questions, but I'm not sure which one it makes sense to go over first. The first is around the different types of organizations, because in your book you have the different colors. You have amber, teal, and several others. And the second thing that I wanted to explore are what some of these companies are doing, who they are. Do you
yeah,
think it makes sense to start with that first, or starting just with the high level of what those different types of companies are, and then we can take a look at the good ones?
yeah, maybe let's do the first one first.
Okay.
So look, sort of, um, so I think the inside of my book is this notion that there are fundamentally different management models, management paradigms, um, and so again, like some of these historians have looked at how over the course of history, when we were hunter gatherers, and then there was the agrarian revolution, and then there was the industrial revolution, and then there was a knowledge revolution, right? And many people feel that we're again in one of these major shifts, that in every of these stages, our thinking changed, our cognition changed, the way we collaborate changed, and at every of these stages, we've also made a leap to a more complex management model, right? And so I can quickly run us through this, and I imagine that listeners might recognize their own organization, in which of these stages they fit. So it looks like the first sort of organizational model arrived when we went from being sort of hunter gatherers to sort of the first chiefdoms, um, and there's this philosopher Ken Wilber who uses colors. So I use these colors. So these are sort of red organizations, and existing versions of that are mafias and street gangs. So these are very organizations, very little formalization, where everything just is based on fear. You have the alpha male, the don, who inspires fear in everyone. And if he ever shows the slightest weakness, and I say he because it's mostly he in these organizations, if he ever shows the slightest weakness, a younger kid is going to come and stab him from the back to take his place, right? And everything is based on personal connection and loyalty. And so these organizations don't scale very well, but they thrive in chaotic environments, right? This seems to be the first sort of structured organization we had, and then comes the agrarian revolution, right? And suddenly we make this leap to these whole other organizations. The metaphor there is like a good organization is like a good army. So you have suddenly we invent, the org chart with formal reporting lines, right? And you have like these different ranks and people wear different uniforms, right? And so that's how we used to run organizations, and still run. Like public schools tend to be run in that way. I think the Catholic Church with like the Pope and the archbishops and the bishops, and right. And so these are very static organizations that don't innovate very much, but are very solid, right? And suddenly we were able to create something like the Catholic Church that sent missionaries around the world, and you would just access whole different skills. And then comes the scientific industrial revolution, and that builds the kind of management paradigm that we still teach in business school that is dominant today, right? And so these pyramid, it adds a number of breakthroughs, right? One of the breakthroughs is the breakthrough of management by objectives, right? So instead of the top giving orders down to everyone, we now suddenly have like these cascading targets and budgets and incentives, right? That make sort of modern performance management, and that just creates a level of innovation that we didn't have before. The other thing is that we come up with innovation, so we suddenly have like marketing departments and R&D departments and product management departments, and where the Catholic Church used to do every year what they did the previous year, suddenly it's a whole different game. Like the more we innovate, the more the more market share and profit we make, right? And so that is a whole different model. And this is the model that is now slowly getting to the end of its shelf life, because it's a model based on a pyramid, based on expertise. A few clever people at the top understand everything, can make these brilliant decisions for everybody else, and all the rest of the pyramid pretty much executes, right? And we simply get to a world that is becoming too complex for that, or simply we get to a world where some of these CEOs say, that's actually not a world I like very much. Like I don't like that world of this small team at the top that's completely overworked, that is going through PowerPoint meeting after PowerPoint meeting, having to make decisions on stuff we don't really understand. And I want to find a way to get the whole of the organizations to be much more involved. And so what I researched and looked at were a number of these pretty extraordinary organizations, for-profit, non-profit, that were founded by some of these people who thought like, I want to do things differently. And what was so fascinating was, even though they didn't know of each other, they ended up doing almost exactly the same kind of things, as if there was, the times were ready for, the next stage to come online. And so, yeah, if you want to, we can talk about some of these organizations.
These are what you call teal organizations, right?
Yeah, just because this one guy used these colors, so we went from red to orange to amber to now to teal.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about what some of those organizations are and maybe what they're doing. It's funny, there was, was this like a couple of weeks ago? Which company was it? Was it Bayer? Was it? There was I think it was the CEO of Bayer who came out. Where he kind of said that this is the approach that they wanted to do. Self-organized teams. They have around 100,000 employees, and he had this idea. It is Bayer. I just looked it up here. And his whole idea was to get rid of management, and that the company of 100,000 employees were going to have 5,000 to 6,000 self-directed teams. They would come together to work for 90 days on projects. After the project is completed, they kind of disband and go create other teams. And so I actually wrote something about this, which I can share with you afterwards. But let's talk about these teal organizations and what they're doing and what other people can kind of learn from that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very excited about what Bob Anderson is doing at Bayer. He used to be the CEO of Genentech, and that was taken over by Roche, and he's done amazing things there. And he often cites my books. I'm just excited to see that kind of stories happening. Maybe if I want to share one story that sort of exemplifies this kind of thing. It's a story of a nursing organization. And I like that story because, nursing is a pretty simple industry to understand. So Buurtzorg is a Dutch neighborhood nursing organizations. So these are nurses that don't work in a hospital, but go to people's homes, people, older folks that need assistance, people who've had accidents and, need a nurse to come by to do whatever medical care. And I think it's a really interesting example because you can see the difference between these models. So, they used to be sort of small neighborhood nursing organizations that were run sort of in this traditional no innovation pyramid model, just a few nurses, they had a boss and, they would go out there and, nothing much would happen. And then in the 1980s, the insurance companies that paid for, most of this work, the health insurance companies decided like, oh no, let's bring modern management into play, right? And so this is the more, in the book, the orange, the modern management that we teach in business schools today, right? And so they brought in a number of innovations that for a while worked really well, but now we're seeing sort of, the downsides, or like how we're reaching the limits of that model. And so what they started by doing is like realizing like, these nurses, some are more experienced and we have to pay them more than others. So let's specialize, these nurses. The expensive nurses will only do the complicated things and everything else will farm out to cheap nurses. You go like, okay, that sort of makes sense. And then they decide, oh, but then, we realize like the nurses have a personal relationship with clients. And that sounds good, but that's actually pretty bad because it means that, you, Jacob, if you're a nurse, you might have like this moment where, between two clients where you have nothing to do because, none of your clients can receive you that moment. So let's take the sort of the mobile phones away from these nurses, and everything goes through a call center and we can just dispatch any nurse at any time. And that, makes the whole system way more efficient. That sounds pretty good, right? And then they realized like, hey, some nurses are much more productive than others. So they decided to standardize the products, right? And so now, changing a compression stocking is 2.5 minutes. That's exactly what it is. Giving a shot is 10 minutes. Giving a shower to an older person is 15 minutes, right? And then they decided, oh, but now that we have these times, these standard times, what we can do is we can have like this planning department in headquarters that sits next to the call center. And they can now make a plan for you, Jacob, where they say like, Jacob, you start at 8 a.m. at this old lady. You change your compression stocking. So you're supposed to be out at by 8:02.5. And then Google Map calculates that you'll be, 6 months later at 8:08.5 with the next client. You give a shot at last 10 minutes. You're out by 8:18.5. And then, right. And so your whole day goes like this. And now what we can do is we can put barcode stickers on the front door of these clients. And every time, Jacob, that you go into, you have to scan this thing. And so that we have now big data and we know exactly where you are. And we know now exactly where you might have lost time. And we can look into this and now say, Jacob, you're really good with shots, but you're not that good with showers. So let's train you on showers, right? Because you really need to shave those just 2 extra minutes that you lose on showers, right? And so, that's sort of one paradigm, one way to look at management, right? And to be honest, like I worked for a number of years at McKinsey, the consulting firm, and this is how we would look at the world, right? These are the sort of recommendations that we would make, right? And it has increased efficiency in a lot of ways, but now the downsides are pretty obvious. Is like nurses hate this, and clients absolutely hate this. Yeah, so imagine the clients. You're an older lady. You're, maybe somewhat confused, and every day there's a different person coming into the intimacy of your home, right? And looking at like, oh, so what do you need? Okay, you need a shot. And then the lady is like, yeah, but it actually changed. I called my doctor yesterday, and you're like, sorry, I don't have time. You give the shot, you're out, right? And so the nurses hate it because, instead of giving good care, which is like have this relationship, try to understand what is really needed, they're just hurried because they know that somebody's watching over their shoulder all this time. And so that's a coherent management model that I have believed in that is, practiced today in the majority of our organizations, right? And here along comes this one nurse, his name is Jos de Blok. He saw these changes, hated them, went into management, one of these firms, tried to change it from the inside, didn't succeed, and said, you know what, I'm just going to create my own thing. And he created Beardsorg. At first, it was just 4 people. Now there are 15,000 people. And he said, you know what? The purpose is not to give the most efficient shot. Like our purpose is to help our clients, lead the most autonomous and the richest lives that they can possibly lead with whatever they have. And so a nurse at Beardsark will go and sit down with a client, take a cup of coffee, and say, where are you at in your life? What can you still do? What can't you do? What's your network of support? Oh, you have children living in town, but they're not actually coming around to help you. Oh, do you want me to invite them? Maybe I can do a meeting and I can mediate, and that kind of relationship, right?
Yeah.
And let me just finish that story because
Yeah,
I think
I
it's
had a question for you, but yeah, finish.
and what they do is that they go back to having like these individual relationships with clients, right? So that they know their clients, and they work in these self-managing teams of 10 to 12 nurses. There is no team leader, that work in this one neighborhood, really know the clients in that neighborhood, know the doctors in that neighborhood, right? And obviously, clients and nurses love it. The clients, have that deep personal relationship back. The nurses love it because they do good work. But the fascinating thing was when they looked at the financials of this, because you could say, like, obviously, it's easy to give good service if you have time to sit down to drink coffee, but who has time to drink coffee, right? We're shaving every minute of every shower, of every compression stocking, right? And what they realized is that nurses at Beardsark were only using 40% of the hours that were prescribed by doctors. So they were saving the insurance companies hundreds of millions of dollars by making patients more autonomous. They basically made sure that patients didn't need them as much, right? And so, by not focusing on the efficiency of the shower, they actually were way more effective than any traditional organization. And what happened is it was so fulfilling for clients and for nurses that over the course of 7 to 8 years, they now employ 2/3 of all neighborhood nurses in the Netherlands. They went from 0% market share to 30%. Like every neighborhood nurse said, like, send, like, at some point they received 200 letters of application, per week, because nurses were just leaving these old organizations saying, can we work for you? Because we just got colleagues, who started and who love it so much, right?
Yeah.
And this entire organization works in these self-managing teams, right? The headquarters is like tiny. It's like 40 people for an organization of 15,000, because all of the expertise is in these self-managing teams. And so that's just a whole different management paradigm. And then we can go into any kind of detail that you want about, like, what's the kind of leadership that is needed for that, and what are the kind of systems. But they clearly outperform any of the traditional organizations.
So I'm really curious about a few things. I was trying to find this section in your book. You had a breakdown of the criteria of the different types of organizations. Is self-management a prerequisite to be a teal organization?
I mean, maybe for one, like, I just use these colors for these stages.
Yeah.
But some people turn this into a goal into itself. Like, we want to be a teal organizations, and I always stop them. Like, you don't want to be a model. Like, you don't want to be like, a brand or something. Like, what do you really want to be? And is self-management something that you as a leader aspire for? Because you said, like, what, I'm tired of everybody just relying on me to make all these decisions. Like, I just want to be, like, in the case of Jos de Blok, he just hated the idea that all of these highly qualified nurses, were debased and had to do, like, all of this kind of work that was way below their intelligence and their pay grade. And he showed, for him, that was just a natural thing to do. I want self-management. And so, yes, self-management is sort of like an integral part of that teal model. And, I talk about 3 breakthroughs, and self-management is one of the 3.
Okay. What if there was a resource out there that could make you a better leader, that could teach you how to create an organizational culture where your employees are engaged, where you could go to figure out how to create a future-ready organization? Well, good news for you. I put that together on my Substack, which you can find at greatleadership.substack.com. We have tens of thousands of members from around the world who every week are getting access to exclusive CEO interviews, leadership hacks and tips, in-depth guides and articles that I write where I share insights and strategies that I come up with and come across in my ongoing and regular work. So if you want to step up your leadership game, if you want to excel in your career, if you want to create a company where employees are engaged at work, and if you are interested in building a future-ready organization, then head over to greatleadership.substack.com. So one of the, and I want you to kind of challenge me on this, because when I heard the Bayer announcement, I was actually a little bit critical of it, because one of the things that I was saying is that, is it necessary for a company like Bayer to go through those extremes to make the changes that they wanted to happen? For example, getting rid of managers, self-organizing teams. Because in a company of 100,000 employees, it seems like a very drastic thing to do, very time-consuming thing to do, a lot of training, a lot of resources. Like, it seems to me that there are a lot of challenges that can happen. And I mentioned that because you remember with Zappos, with holacracy, and holacracy was kind of a big theme that happened for a while that ended up dying off. And so the argument that I was making for Bayer is that, there are lots of changes that you can make without going to those extremes. And I'm kind of curious where you sit on that. So for example, Bayer could have, created a less hierarchical organization. They could have invested more in creating better leaders to make them act more like coaches and mentors instead of getting rid of leaders. They could have done other things instead of just self-organizing teams for 90 days and then kind of disbanding. So how do you balance kind of the practical realities of doing something with not going too far? And I'll give you kind of just a tangential example. There were lots of companies, and this was around the time when your book came out too, that they were getting rid of annual engagement surveys. Remember, they were getting rid of annual performance reviews. They were trying to do like all these crazy things. And then I've interviewed a lot of these organizations, and they're like, yeah, we realize that that's actually a mistake. And now most of the companies are going back to that stuff because they realize they want standards, they want processes and rules in certain areas. And a lot of employees actually wanted that stuff too. So how do you, like, if you're working with an organization, how do you make that balance of making effective change, but not going too far where it becomes like a Zappos where they had to abandon holacracy because they just, and maybe you have insight into why it failed. But you see kind of where I'm going, right? Like it's a delicate balance of how much you can do before you cause chaos.
Yeah. I mean, so for one thing, we know that these new models work because we have organizations like Buurtzorg who've been around now for a long time. And, once they found their groove, are just extraordinarily effective and stable. And,
Yeah.
so we know that these new models work. And your
But
question,
did they
how
start
do
from
we,
the ground up like that, or were they? Because I guess that's the challenge, right? If you start like that versus change
yeah,
to that.
yeah. We have examples of both. We have examples of organizations that, Buurtzorg was an organization like that started from, the beginning. That was just, and then we have examples of organizations that were traditional organizations, had a new leadership, and the new leadership, transitions them. The most interesting example there was an organization called AES that, acquired power plants all over the world.
AES?
AES, yes.
AES. Okay, I'm going to look them up.
And they acquired power plants all over the world, and so they had a real track record of transitioning these very hierarchical power plants, like often in like ex-Soviet Union, in places that had very, very hierarchical cultures, right? And had a way to do that, and often it was a slower way than the one you're describing now, where it took them often 2 years to sort of build that trust, etc., before they made some of the bigger changes. And so I fully hear you. I'm not familiar enough with the current situation at Bayer to make any comments on this, and so I don't know. Maybe they're going too radical, and maybe they're going too fast. It was certainly the case at Zappos,
Yeah.
where it was just
Yeah. What happened there? Why did that? Because I remember everybody was talking about it. This is the new way of management, and there was case studies, and I think like everybody was talking about it. And then what was it? A couple of years later, they're like, "Oh my goodness, problems."
Yeah, I mean, I can share a little bit of what I know, which was that Zappos was an extraordinarily effective organization for a while, right? They were very, very recognized. They were sort of a traditional hierarchical organization, um, and it had put a lot of focus on company culture, right? And so, as a way for company culture to overcome the limitations of the pyramid and the power over that you have in any sort of hierarchical relationship, right? And for a while, it worked really, really well, and then they grew and grew and grew, and it was harder and harder for just the culture to counterbalance, the bureaucratization that happens, the layers of management as the organization grows, and you know, and so Tony Hsieh was frustrated with that,
Hmm.
and he happened to stumble upon my book, was had sort of stars in his eyes, and then sort of like made like this completely rash decision of like, you know what, no more managers, like everybody has to read Fred's book, and you have, I don't know, remember, it was like you have 2 weeks to decide, like,
Yeah.
you
Oh,
know
yeah. I forgot about that announcement.
take 3 months of,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
or,
remember that. Yeah, that was
and I mean,
crazy.
it was completely, I mean, it was just him with his frustration that just like went out there, hadn't thought it through. And then so a lot of people left and took the 3 months paycheck.
Yeah,
And
I
then like
remember
there was
that.
press about it. And then they figured, oh, now this isn't working. So let's find a formalized structure. And they used holacracy. And holacracy, I have a lot of respect for holacracy. So holacracy is a formalized methodology to do self-management, but it was sort of at the opposite of the team culture of Zappos. Zappos team culture was all freewheeling, all, bring your messy self to work, be a little quirky, and holacracy is like exactly by the book. Like this is exactly like there's a constitution that is like dozens of pages long,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
how we run a meeting, and in that order. And I mean, it was just a complete cultural reject.
Mm.
Um,
So
and
how,
so,
so how do you find that then balance of what to do? Because to your point, some companies can get a little excited
Mhm.
and a little carried away. Because to me, it sounds like really what you're advocating for, and it's something that I've talked about for a long time, is you basically change some of the core workplace practices of your organization around your people. You kind of make people first.
Mhm.
And I guess depending on the company, that can mean different things, right? Maybe it's self-organized teams for some companies. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's reducing hierarchy for another organization instead of just abolishing all and creating self-organized teams. Like, is there almost like a criteria or a checklist that the companies need to follow? And actually, before we get to that, let's talk about the balance piece first. How do you maintain that balance? Because some people listening to you might be getting excited by this and thinking, okay, I'm going to buy the book. I'm going to, do everything that he says in there. How do you like go in a measured response?
Yeah. Um, so much to say about it. For those people who are interested about that, after the book came out, having conversations with a lot of organizations that made this transition, I learned so much about the pitfalls, what to avoid, what not to do, but also what works. That I created a whole video series around it. It's freely accessible. It's pay what feels right. So it's not behind a paywall. So there's 130 videos, 10 to 15 minutes longs, about like all of the pitfalls and all the ways to do that transition. So if people, maybe we can link to it in the
Yeah,
notes.
yeah. Is there a URL that you can mention that people can go check that out? Is it pretty easy to
Yeah,
find?
it's because the thing is called Insights for the Journey. As you make that journey,
Okay.
the URL is thejourney.reinventingorganizations.com. So the journey.
Thejourney.reinventingorganization.com. Okay, cool. We'll link that as well.
And so, the first thing that I invite leaders to do in there is, before they make any rash decisions, is that they do actually quite some introspection of like, why do I want to change? What is really driving me? Very personally, what are my frustrations? What are some of the things that I'm in the current system that I actually don't like, right? That feel demeaning to me as a leader, or feel demeaning to my people, but I just do because I do them that way, right? And get clarity around that. What might be the wrong reasons for me to do it? Like I've seen leaders go there simply because like self-management sounds great. Like I just tell my people, just you go figure it out. You just make
Yeah, yeah,
decisions,
yeah.
right?
I've seen that as well.
Yeah, and that's obviously totally the wrong way. And then people, you don't provide any structure, any transition to it, and then people don't know what to do. Whole thing becomes chaos, and then suddenly, these leaders and go like, "Oh, looks like my people aren't mature enough after all." So we'll have to go back to more traditional management, right? And it was just because they hadn't thought it through. So, I suggest quite some preparation time just for you as a leader of, for some leaders, they really want to, share more power. They want to show up more whole. They want to show up more vulnerable, right? But then they're not well prepared for that at all,
Yeah.
and they make stumbles. I know that you were interested in the question of vulnerability, and and so you know preparing that thing for yourself, often with the help of somebody, of a coach, and really clarifying your intentions is really an integral part of that.
Okay.
And the other suggestion is don't make it a program. Don't make it sort of a top-down, mandated thing. But start working. Where are the pain points? In your organization, maybe budget is the pain point. Maybe the budgeting exercise drains everybody. Everybody knows that this budgeting thing doesn't work. That you put all this time. People are sandbagging. People are not giving the real numbers. People are protecting themselves. It becomes this thing. As soon as we have the budget, like a month later, 2 months later, it's out of date anyway because the world has changed. But people still stick to it. Let's say that is the thing that really drains the energy of the organizations. Then let's start there.
Yeah.
Right. Rather than some mental idea of like, oh, we should do self-management, or we should, do programs for people to show up whole at work, or we should, no, like in your case, start with where the pain is at. Right. And so there's a number of these principles that I think can help you make sort of a graceful transition.
Let's spend the next, 15 minutes or so, and this is a section I call the Leader's Toolkit, where we give people some kind of actionable advice and things that they could do.
Yeah.
So let's talk about where to begin. So I don't know, I guess there are a couple of different angles we could look at. I don't know if we want to go through kind of like a checklist, or, before we even go through the checklist, maybe it's taking a step back in high level, how to identify if you think you even need to change. So let's say a company's getting introduced to some of these concepts and ideas, and they're thinking about, okay, what do I do? Obviously buy the book, look at the video series, but is there anything practical and tactical that people can do just after listening to this that you recommend? My conversation with Frederic Laloux continues only for premium subscribers of Great Leadership Plus on Apple Podcasts. When you subscribe there, you're going to get a bonus episode every week, as well as ad-free listening. And in this bonus conversation with Frederic, we're going to be going over how to become a teal organization. He's going to share some strategies, some tips, and some steps that you can take inside of your organization today. And again, when you subscribe, a weekly bonus episode, ad-free listening. And I hate ads. I'm sure you hate ads, but a lot of podcasters like myself run ads because they provide revenue for the show. So if you don't want to get those ads, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can also head over to greatleadership.substack.com, subscribe to the newsletter. That's where you can get access to the show notes, transcripts, things like that, as well as content that I write every week on leadership, the future of work, and employee experience. So if you enjoyed this show, please send it to somebody who you would like to see become a better leader. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.